Welcome to the Lucidworks series, Connected Experiences with me, Jess Jurva, Chief Customer Officer. Our episodes explore the human side of connected experiences, what having a connected experience means, and how to build more connected experiences with the world around us. Today, I'm joined by Jeanette Melgarejo, Senior Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Recruiting at Clif Bar. Welcome, Jeanette.
Hi, Jess. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Today, our theme is Connected Experiences with Identity through the lens of Hispanic Heritage Month. So, Jeanette, let's dive right in. If you could, would you tell the audience today how you would describe yourself and your identity?
Yeah, I'll start by saying my pronouns are she, her, ella in Spanish. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I currently occupy in East Oakland, which is the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone people, specifically the Lishan people. If you are curious about the land that you currently occupy, I encourage you to visit nativeland.ca. And there are definitely some Indigenous-led organizations where you can donate time, money, and whatever you can. So I identify as a cisgender woman. I'm a first-generation Mexican American, and I also sort of identify as Latinx in certain spaces. And what I want to call to that is there are probably a lot of names that you've heard to sort of encompass a community of people, right? Hispanic, Latino, Latin, Latina. There are so many different sort of terms used. And I'd love to just talk a little bit about sort of the origin first to give people sort of a context of where this sort of came about and how to be. And I'll kind of go back a little bit and you can sort of, I guess, stop me if I'm going too far off course.
Love it. Yeah.
So in the 1960s, the three largest Latin American diaspora in the US were Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans, sort of all spanning across the US. Mexicans more so in the Southwest, Puerto Ricans and Cubans in the East. And so living in different parts of the US sort of identified different needs. I mean, in Texas, some folks that identified as Mexican were still under Jim Crow restrictions. In California, they were still segregated by schools and discriminated against. And so in the sort of 1960s, the census, there was no Hispanic category. It was just a Spanish surname count, right? And so there was some work that went into sort of how do we find a way to identify people's needs, but also sort of in similar spaces like the Spanish speaking category. So I think it was in the Richard Nixon sort of era that one of his staffers decided that Hispanic was going to be the sort of easiest way to group folks by. And one of the things that I would call to is I follow, I mean, there's Hispanic Heritage Month, but I wouldn't outright tell someone, oh, I'm Hispanic. And the reason being is that it's a very sort of conservative term, and it was used to sort of connect folks back to Spain, which is not something that I necessarily identify, right? In my indigenous roots in Mexico. And so now fast forward to like today, we have a lot of data on Hispanic / Latino on the census. But there's also sort of this like return to our indigenous roots with the Latinx term, and the X is really inserted to sort of indigenize us once again, but it also sort of removes the gendering of that language, right? To sort of honor some non-binary folks that may not identify with one gender or another. So that's a little bit about the history.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And learning about where Hispanic Heritage Month came from, or even that term. One of the things that you had mentioned is in sort of how you identify is, Latinx, or I'm sure at different times, depending on the groups that you're in, you may use a different term. Can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of hey, I have to code switch sometimes depending on where I'm at. I'd love to hear your experience around that.
Yeah, absolutely. In certain spaces, and I will say in sort of predominantly white spaces,
Mhm.
I do tend to sort of lean more toward the Latinx identifier only because it's a way for, I think, folks to think a little bit more broadly about it. And
Mhm.
also in many ways, I feel like it honors again those indigenous roots. It also sort of gives permission or way to say like,
Mhm.
you don't have to connect me back to this sort of European colonizer
Mhm.
country to like make me and my identity feel validated, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And yeah, and sometimes it's challenging too, because I think a lot of the boomer generation sort of prioritize nationalities over
Mhm.
generalizations, because that was sort of the story then, to say like, oh well, I'm Mexican or I'm Guatemalan, or whatever they identified as then.
Mhm.
And now it's sort of bringing into a space of like, we are one large community, we are one large sort of powerhouse, and we identify together. But also to just kind of give permission for folks to really sort of call back those roots.
Yeah. Yeah. And in your most comfortable space, or setting, how do you identify, like when you feel the most relaxed and that you can be yourself? How would you describe your identity in that setting?
Yeah, and I'm smiling because I'm thinking about that space. It's like, it is my ERG, which I know we'll talk about a little bit, but in that space, I happily identify as Mexicana, first
Mhm.
generation.
Mhm.
And I speak pretty openly about my family's origins in this country and their documentation status. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember introducing myself in this space for the first time, and it was the very first time that I felt safe enough
Mm.
to talk about my grandpa and to talk about how they got here, right? Even though, as many, or maybe not many, know, um, California was part of Mexico up until
Yeah.
1846, right? And a large
Yeah.
part of the Southwest. But to be able to sort of talk openly about that, I'm very proud to claim, my Mexican roots,
Yeah.
and speak openly in those safe spaces.
Yes, I love that. So let's talk about the ERG that you just referenced. So as you're working on big projects within Clif Bar, A, what are some of those things? And B, how do you experience Clif Bar on a daily basis in terms of how you connect with your identity and your workplace?
It's a lot. I'll start. I'll try to tackle it one piece at a time. So, sort of in my work, and then sort of the identity
Yeah,
piece. I mean,
great.
they merge. So I have diversity, equity, and inclusion in my title, right? And I also identify as a woman of color. So there are sort of these gray areas where
Yeah.
sometimes I'm navigating in a space of educating people, but then in one breath, I'm also talking a lot about, not putting free labor on people of color
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
order to sort of correct yourself or to learn more. So some of the work that I'm very excited that I'm working on at Clif Bar, is really creating inclusive recruiting practices.
Mhm.
So really looking at, from who we partner with all the way down to how people interview,
Mhm.
and how you can be more inclusive, both from whether it be a racial or ethnic identity, a sexual orientation identity, a
Mhm.
neurodiversity. There are just so many parts and dimensions of our identities that people often forget that they are either excluding or maybe causing harm to.
Mhm.
And so, really like picking apart this whole process.
And
So
can I
that's
ask
sort
a
of,
question about that
yeah,
specifically?
yeah.
So is it that at times you're seeing, let's even call it some bias towards, hey, if someone doesn't have a traditional background and they're in an underrepresented group, you might require more of them, versus if it were a white person, right? And you kind of implicitly trust. Is that more of what you're seeing at times?
Yeah, and there's something, I can't remember exactly where I heard this, but There is sort of an innate bias in all of us, but
Yeah.
particularly we see this in with people who identify as white in the workplace in a sort of position of power, is that
Yeah.
they are more willing, and this is a generalization, I don't want to
Yeah.
like, specifically call anyone, but um, in those situations, you're often more willing to provide and look to someone's potential if they look
Mhm.
like you. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
Whereas someone who maybe doesn't look like you and has a different experience, has a different background, you're more likely to sort of push on their experience and sort of get them to prove to you why they deserve to be in that
Right.
place.
Right.
Um, and so something I love to call out in this space is just to look at, the history of access.
Hmm.
And not everyone is going to have the same access. Not everyone has had the same access. So you have to sort of be willing to kind of challenge your own bias going into the process and think about like, where am I maybe inserting some bias that may
Hmm.
show up bad, right? Because bias it exists, it's real. We can't like talk
Right.
about, how it doesn't exist. It exists. There is no sort of, I guess, morality attached to bias. It's more about what you do with it, right? So
Yeah.
you could use bias for good, you could use bias to obviously, not good.
Yeah.
And so in this process, yeah, there's a little bit of just kind of calling attention to it and
Hmm.
really naming it and finding the sort of best way to work out of it.
Yeah.
And you won't always be able to eliminate bias in the process. We're humans. So it's also that recognition of like, it's not going to be perfect, it's going to come in, but how do we sort of develop a framework of accountability for ourselves to say, like, this is
Yeah.
how we move
Yeah.
forward and this is how we come back?
Yeah, I love what you just said, and it kind of calls to mind the many discussions that we've had around microaggressions. So when we're talking about, hey, these things exist, but there's a way to one recognize them and two do better about them, because they're not going to go away. Like how. And recently, I think or coming up, you're going to be doing a talk around microaggressions. So, can you
Mhm.
tell the audience today a little bit about how you look at microaggressions in the workplace and what you think a good path is in terms of, hey, if you notice this or you recognize it, here are things to do.
Yeah. So microaggressions, I would define as sort of a small or subtle behavior that happens in casual encounters that
Hmm.
makes anyone feel other. That's sort of the simplified version of it. And so the the areas that we often experience microaggressions are in part of our identities, right? So we all
Hmm.
have a number of different identities. It's age, race, gender,
Right.
et cetera. And so that would be what I consider a microaggression, right? Something that's small and makes people feel othered.
Hmm.
However, they're called micro, but they have a macro impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a ton of research. I'm also happy to share a little more of that that exists around the harmful effects of microaggressions. But an example of one, and I've kind of seen this one happen in the workplace pretty
Hmm.
often, is someone asking someone to take notes during a meeting.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's not so much asked, it's more like a voluntold, right? Where
Hmm.
what you're saying is, I do not see you as someone who is at a certain level, right?
Right.
Or making it clear that they are um, not a person to be included in that area.
Right.
It's
Right.
saying like, and it sometimes happens pretty often with women. So
Right.
that's one place to recognize it, where people will be
Well,
like, oh, but you have such
yeah.
great handwriting.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's,
to your point around value, it's almost like their value is being reduced to, hey, the most you can contribute here is to note take.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so one call out to that I would say is that sometimes it's not just in the language that you
Mm-hmm.
use, but it's in the tone, right?
Yeah.
Because you could follow it up with that like joke, like, oh, but your handwriting's so great. And
Mm.
I mean, on the receiving end, that feels really crappy, right?
Yes.
It's like, wait, you're saying my handwriting's great, but you're also saying that I don't necessarily belong here. So,
Yeah.
um, so that's, they happen, and they happen in sort of those really quick moments. And sometimes it's really hard to come back from them. So, I can jump into a little bit of sort of maybe some micro inclusions or micro interventions.
Great.
Um,
Let's hear it.
yeah, so I think one of the sort of there's micro interventions, micro inclusions. The way I kind of look at it is like microaggressions are negative, micro interventions are sort of the neutral zone, and then micro inclusions are sort of the positive zone. And examples of micro interventions are if you, as sort of a bystander, or maybe even someone who's in a position of power, or if you notice something like you are not of the identity that's being microaggressed against, that you
Mm-hmm.
can step in,
Mm.
and really kind of, you know, inject yourself or interject in the microaggression as it's happening, and really just kind of call it out, right? So
Yeah.
it can be very quick. It can be, you know, a question that's asked like, hey, I don't know if I understood you correctly, could you reframe that?
Right.
And in that moment, I mean, you kind of have to take a little bit of a U-turn and say like, oh, wait a minute, why would I need to reframe that? Maybe that came out in a way that wasn't great, so let me
Sure.
correct. And sometimes you can sort of course correct in that
Yeah.
way. And then when we think about, you know, micro inclusions are sort of these small symbolic actions that sort of recall to our humanity, right? So it's a
Mm-hmm.
small step to include someone. I've noticed this done in my workplace, especially as we've moved into a virtual world where we're on Zoom, and sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of hard to tell, like, where's the conversation going? Can I jump in now? And something that actually one of my directors did very well was she would actually call on people and say, hey, it looks like Jeanette, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Mm.
What would you like to say? Or like, we really want to
Yeah.
hear what you'd like to say.
Yeah.
Um, and so again, the term like micro and macro, right? The sort of intent can often be micro, like, oh, I didn't realize that I was hurting or offending somebody, but the impact is macro.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. And so when you are kind of teaching and educating people on this, I believe at one point you had said there's kind of three steps in how you recognize, own, and correct it. Can you talk
Yeah.
about, like, accept, own, and correct? Like, what does that mean to you? How do you tell people about that and what they need to do?
Yeah, I learned from some really great folks in the space, and I'll have to call out. This is Janice G. Asare, who writes for Forbes. She came up with this sort of method of the accept, own, and correct. And the accept is really, again, like taking that U-turn and saying, like, what was just said, and even though it wasn't my intent, like understanding that it did cause harm, so accept it,
Hmm.
and then really owning it. So owning and taking accountability for your actions. And then the third step is sort of to say, like, okay, how do I correct it? And another really great woman that I learned from, Amber Cabral, she led an inclusive leadership training at Clif Bar for us. She said, an apology is two parts, right? An apology is two parts because one part is the I'm sorry or please forgive me.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
the second part is that sort of correct, right? So in the future, I will, or going forward, I will do XYZ. And one of the things that I want to call out and sort of the correct is, I think in this sort of last year of racial awakening and recognition of just kind of inequities in the world following the murder of George Floyd, a lot of folks started to talk about like doing the work and what
Hmm.
that means and picking up books, etc. And when we think about this sort of space of correct, I think there's some grace that's allowed in sort of like, let me go educate myself on this.
Sure.
But then there's also moments where I have to sort of stand firm and say, please, please, please do not ask any BIPOC folks for free labor in this space.
Right.
Using folks of color to educate yourself or sort of broaden your understanding is actually another form of microaggression, right? It's harmful.
Right.
And so,
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say the accept, own, correct is a great model. And then also remembering that apologies, we're just as humans not very good at apologizing,
Right.
but to really remember that they are two parts. Like,
Right.
yes, you're sorry, but what are you going to do about it going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. And one of the things that you just said is that, the free labor that's put on the BIPOC community. And I think any underrepresented group, sometimes when you're the only individual in a company or in a group setting or in a space where, even LGBTQ, at times I might be the only gay person. If there's any gay topic that comes up, it's like, just because you're there, they think that you know everything and you're directed to be the person to educate everyone on anything related to gay. And I can imagine that being a thousandfold with the BIPOC community and the various awareness and education that's going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard a stat yesterday that was, in a corporate setting, there need to be 3 Latinos in the room for one of those Latinos to speak up.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And it's not funny, but interesting because I was thinking about my own department, right?
Yeah.
And the function that I sit in. And I often look at, a grid of Zoom little Brady Bunch boxes of photos,
Yeah.
and I don't see anyone that looks like me.
Right.
But more
Right.
recently, I've been able to have, more influence in hiring more folks of color, and now there are more than just one Latino or a Latino identifying person in the group. And so I actually noticed, when I heard this, I noticed how much having him join the team impacted how much louder my voice got in spaces like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
There's a sense
Yeah.
of comfort, I think, and
Sure.
like you'll
Yeah.
see
And
people call it like the
solidarity.
nod.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit as it relates to ERGs and sort of connecting with other people that identify in a similar way as you do. For anyone who's like joining a new company, how would you, or what would you recommend in terms of finding others? Like, some are going to be in thousands people companies, right? Or employee companies. Others might be in something smaller where an ERG doesn't exist. What are ways that you feel others can connect with like other like individuals?
Yeah, ERGs are a super great space. And I do want to talk a little bit more about ERGs in my ERG, because I'm super excited about it. But if you are in a space where you either don't have ERGs, or you just kind of feel uncomfortable reaching out to, understand if other people identify like you, there are some really great Slack communities. So there are some really tech specific ones too, like Afrotech, I believe, has one. There's a Latinas in Tech. There's one called Tequeria, which is like a play on
Awesome.
and so joining those, they're free to join, they're
Yeah.
open to everyone, but there's definitely some ways to sort of network in those spaces with folks who identify the way that you do. But to go into the ERGs, I joined Clif Bar virtually at the week that we went into shelter in place.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah.
So it was an interesting onboarding experience, to say the least. But something that I found that was really helpful was asking other folks like who they know, or if there were like cross-functional meetings that I could join. And being pretty explicit about saying like, hey, I want to find my place here and I want to feel like I belong here. Sometimes organizations will do like a new hire onboarding, set you up with a buddy so that you have someone. We're working on getting that to be included in the ERGs, so that if you say like, hey, I'm interested in this ERG, or I identify as this particular identity, sign me up for a buddy from the ERG.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't have ERGs when I got to Clif Bar. So I had to do a lot of the sort of like asking around, like who knows who, what's going on for
Yeah.
Hispanic Heritage Month, and slowly sort of people started to trickle in. But one of the things that we did at Clif Bar that sort of led to the birth of these ERGs today was that shortly after, I call it now sort of like the racial awakening in America,
Mm-hmm.
and especially in the corporate setting. Following George Floyd's murder, there was a lot of opportunity to sort of like just hold space and
Yeah.
hold some safe spaces. So I led a Latinx leaders forum just to say like, hey, there's a lot of conversations around race right now. There's a lot of harm being done to BIPOC communities, and harm that's like happening virtually, right? So you kind
Mm-hmm.
of don't know how to even take it. It was a strange time. And so we led one for our Black employees, one for anyone who identified as AAPI, and then anyone who identified as Latinx.
Mm-hmm.
And in this Latinx Leaders Forum, I met my now close friend, but my co-chair for the Latinx the Latinx ERG, Antoinette. And that relationship, having someone who, I mean, she shared a lot of personal details in this forum, right, about how she identifies and how challenging it has been when you're in a very homogenous group. And when I say homogenous, I mean, we have, the majority is of cisgender, male, a lot of folks that identify as heterosexual, and a lot of folks that identify as white and able-bodied. And so there's sort of this like common thread there, and to sort of find your place in all of that while virtual, but then also in sort of this, unrest in the country was really challenging. And so from that group, all of our ERGs were sort of born, but in particular, I'm just super excited and so proud of the work that we've been doing around building this space, because what we kept hearing in our sort of kickoff calls was like, I didn't know that I needed this until it popped up, right?
Yeah.
And it's a space, again, like I said in the beginning, that's safe, that you can just kind of like let your hair down and the code switching can go out the window. And I oftentimes express myself part in Spanish, part in English, because it's just what feels natural to me, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to be in that space and talk so loudly and proudly about my family's origins and our history and our documentation status without fear, because I think that's another piece of identities that people sort of fail to recognize. And someone posted on LinkedIn recently, they had just gotten hired at this company, and there was, I think, sponsorship of a visa, and a manager called it out in a meeting. And it's one of those things where, yeah, they tried to make a joke about it, but it's one of those things where, like, in particularly, I'm speaking from my identity, and as a Mexican, you kind of want to make yourself invisible, right? Because of the sort of political nature that has existed with ICE, with all of these things, right? And so growing up, I remember thinking like, oh my God, I can't talk about where my family's from, or I can't talk about the fact that my dad is undocumented and my stepdad's undocumented, and all of these folks in my sort of family are undocumented. And so again, like going back to just these safe spaces and sort of how we connect with one another, the ERGs have really existed as a space for people to just like let their hair down and be, and not have to think about like, is this the proper thing to say, or can I talk about this because I'm at work?
Not be judged or not have fear, right?
To
live your truth.
Yeah.
So, you're talking a lot about the different connected experiences that you have, specifically around your identity and what you do in the workplace around DEI. When I first approached you about doing this series and being a guest, and framed up to you, hey, we want to talk about connected experiences, what were some of the first thoughts that came to your mind around what connected experiences mean?
Yeah, I thought about a lot of things. I think the first sort of place that I thought about was just like a place of psychological safety, right? Like those
Yeah.
are connected experiences, connecting to all of the ways that we are who we are and all of those
Mhm.
identities, especially now, like in the workplace, when you're talking about like bring your authentic self to work, and
Right, right.
all of these spaces. And I just like, eh, yeah, I kind of went down this rabbit hole of like, well, connected experiences and technology, and like, how do we connect as humans? But in my work, really thinking about how, everything is really connected,
Mhm,
connected by the way of, impact on people, or
mhm.
connected in the way of like, how do you connect to the work that you're doing, and how do you really thrive in an environment? So those were some of the first thoughts I had.
Yeah, yeah, appreciate that. So, and so as you think about that, kind of throughout your whole life, right, in terms of connections you've made over the course of your life and career, um, the importance of that and the value of that, whether it be personal or professional, what does that mean to you? What kind of value does that have in terms of I would say, the requirement in life around having these connected experiences?
Yeah. I think about, especially in this last, what are we in, like almost 2 years in this pandemic,
Hmm, hmm.
being at home. I think a lot about the importance of just like staying connected and checking in.
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends in my life that are really good about just kind of like, even if it's just a quick, text message or something, to check in and connect. And then I think about too, like these social networks that we have, right? Like we are
Hmm.
so connected, but really we're very disconnected
Right.
from our humanity in a lot of ways. But I think a lot about just the importance of remaining connected to people, and whether it be, for moments like this and sort of developing this ERG, or
Hmm.
reconnecting with individuals for a job. I mean, the person that I was talking about earlier who joined our department is someone that I worked with years ago.
Yeah.
And he remained somebody that I just thought very highly of. And I thought he would be a really great addition to the team. And sure enough, he went through the interview process and everyone's like, where has he been hiding? Um, so I think about just these connected experiences and connections with people is just like, they sort of kind of weave in and out of your life. And,
Yeah.
whether it be for like a professional need or a personal need, staying connected as people is just very important, and connected to yourself, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big one that I know we could probably go down a rabbit hole on that one as well, in terms of a connected experience with your own self. Okay, so let me ask you another question, a little related to what we just talked about around connected experiences, not only what they mean to you kind of personally and professionally, but as you experience the world around you, with different brands. You work at Clif Bar, which is a major brand. There's other major brands like Dove, who's doing a great sort of, I would say, body of work around DEI and sort of how they show diversity in body size, as well as with people of color in their ads. What are the brands that you kind of connect with or think are doing a good job? Or, is there another perspective you have on how brands are inclusive?
Yeah, that's such a great question. There's a lot that comes to mind. One of the first things that comes to mind is like there's sort of a lack of corporate transparency in this
Mhm.
space too. A lot of companies ran to sort of make these statements for Black
Yeah.
Lives Matter, and ran to, start advertising. And advertisements are great. I'm not going
Hmm.
to say, they're bad and terrible idea, but um, advertising and true representation are two
Yeah.
very different
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
right?
Love that. Yeah.
Um, and there are a few different ways that I think about this. One is I live in East Oakland. I live in a predominantly Latino neighborhood. There are a ton of small businesses around me. And this is also in the way that I think about when we're giving jobs to folks that, again, don't come
Mhm.
from a certain background, right? That money is being recirculated within that community. I think there was a statistic that I read recently about the circulation of a dollar,
Mhm.
and and sort of how long it stays in the Black community versus um, the Asian community. I think the approximate was 28 days.
Mm.
In a Jewish community, it's 19 days. In white community, it's 17 days. And in the Black community, it's just 6 hours. So, yeah. So when you think about that, it's putting money in places and in hands of people who, are Black owned businesses or support other Black owned businesses in their supply
Mhm.
chain. I think that's a huge part of it. So when I think about like, oh yeah, what are some of the brands that I support? I've actually started to be a little bit more critical about like
Mhm.
who I am supporting, because I'll go and I'll check, like what do their board of directors look like?
Yeah.
Like they've put out this mission. I think Ben and Jerry's actually did one of the best, and I know that their message got circulated around, but like they put out a message, but they also sort of backed it up by saying like, here are our diverse suppliers. Here's our, goal around ethnic, gender, et cetera, diversity across all of our employees. And there are so many resources out there. There's a really great website and app. I'm going to mess up the name here and I'll have to remember it. I think it's called Mirai, and
Mhm.
it's an app, but they specifically work with Black-owned companies and businesses, and share. And you can search like I'm looking for art, and it'll pop up with a ton of Black artists. And there's also this thing called the Black Dollar Index,
Mm.
um, and this is essentially a scoring system that rates, across, I think it's like 0 to 100 on corporations. Like we'd give this a 70 rating because they have X, Y, and Z. And it's really like those critical factors for racial equity. But my recommendation, and also if I'm being super, super transparent and honest, which I try to be, is that it's also not easy sometimes, right? Like there
Mhm.
is a convenience factor to like running to your Whole Foods or running to Trader Joe's or what have you versus going to the mom and shop, place down the street. And so I just want to acknowledge that it is challenging to put, your money back into some of these, BIPOC owned businesses. But it's worth the effort because what you're
Right.
doing is investing in the communities that they operate in. And same with, people who live in these places. Like my dollars will go to some of these owned businesses. So
Right. Right. That's really interesting data, Jeanette, that you represented about the BIPOC community's economic buying power. Can you talk or focus specifically around the Latino Hispanic economic buying power?
yeah, absolutely. I mentioned very early on in our conversation today, information about the census, right? So even being
Hmm.
counted as a population is still somewhat new. And so with the recent census, we got a ton of data on Latinos and Hispanic folks in the US alone. And some of those pieces were really focused around purchasing power. So
Hmm.
the Latino or Hispanic purchasing power is expected to reach $1.9 trillion
Wow.
by 2023.
Mm.
And just to kind of put that into context, if the Latino or Hispanic demographic were measured in terms of a country, on its own, it would be the seventh largest GDP in the world. So
Wow.
that's
That's
even greater than
incredible.
countries, yeah, even greater than countries like Australia, Spain, and even Mexico. And so something that I think about too, again, as we go back to like the marketing and the advertising from brands, is really to not exclude the population of
Hmm. Hmm.
Latinos. In the pandemic, I mean, so many inequities existed around, work and jobs and
Hmm.
support and everything. But one of the things that I read was about really thinking about the Latino consumer. Not only do we, I think it's something like 40% of folks live in a multi-generational home. So not only do you have, a span of different ages to appeal to, but they are, I think, the youngest in terms of population growth. I'm forgetting the number right now, but as of right now, they've accounted for 51% of the country's growth on this 2020
Mm.
census. And so really thinking about like, how do you tap into that purchasing power of the Latino community? Because oftentimes a lot of brands ignore the needs of various consumers, right? And so how do you appeal to a particular audience, but especially an audience that's on the rise? And I think the majority of our growth, if I remember correctly, was in sort of millennials. I think the average age is like 28. And so these are folks that are going into their first jobs and going to be able to buy and to be treated as a desired consumer. So
yeah, that's so fascinating. And in essence, and I know that this is a passion of yours, is creating generational wealth in the Black and Brown communities, right?
Yeah, very much so. I could talk all day about generational wealth.
Yeah.
And to I guess just quickly speak on what that means so that people kind of understand. I come from a single parent home. Again, first generation. My dad was not born here; he was born in Mexico. And for me, they're even thinking about going to college, right? Like, here's something that was like so groundbreaking because I went to undergrad and then I did go get my MBA. And I think to my grandma, who in her small town in Mexico, it's called Langostura, it's very tiny. She repeated the third grade 3 times because that was as far as her education could go, was to the 3rd grade.
Wow.
And so to me, learning is super valuable because I think about, and I could go into the higher education system being problematic. But when I talk about generational wealth, I talk about, thinking about what are we leaving for the generations to come, right? My grandparents made it here with $0 in their pocket. They own property. My mom owns property. Like, now they're starting to be able to do this and to sort of pass on. But I remember thinking about, like, when I was preparing for college, like how little exposure to the college applications process I had because I was the first to go to school, and just like how little preparation exists around that because of the fact that it's not something that has been sort of traditionally known in my community. And so generational wealth is really being able to pass on some kind of inheritance to the generations that come, because we literally come from, $0, and here's what we've built. So it's a big passion of mine.
Yeah, excellent. So let's talk a little bit more about your family, your connection to your family's history, and your, talking about having a connected experience with yourself. You recently posted, a writing on LinkedIn, just around, I would say, call it a connected experience with yourself and your family. And I'd love for you to share with us today a little bit about that.
Yeah, that post was so hard to write because, again, think about a safe space. Again, like LinkedIn is not a safe space.
Yeah, wide open, girl, public.
Wide open. And to be able to talk about documentation status on LinkedIn and celebrate, the contributions of Latinos and Hispanic folks in this country. That was really hard. And I've been doing this thing, and my grandma probably may not listen to this. She also doesn't speak a ton of English, but she understands it. So if she were to listen, she would know. But I do this thing where whenever I go see her, and I see her almost every weekend, she doesn't live too far from me, but whenever I go see her, we spend hours talking. And I do this thing where I'll set my phone on the table and start recording from a voice memo, because I'll often just like ask her questions like, how did we get here? And like, what was your first job? And all of that. And so I hope she never finds out that I'm doing this, because I have hours of conversations with her and my grandpa, just talking about their history and talking about how they got here. And something that I want to like speak to that is that, you know, oral history and storytelling is so native to our culture. Like, I was joking about this with a neighbor recently, like ingredients and recipes are never written down. They're always like told. So whenever I try to cook something that my grandma has made, she's like, oh, you do a little bit of this and a little bit of this. And I have to like really watch carefully because nothing is written down.
Yeah.
And there's this just like beauty to when I think about, connected experiences and connecting back to my identities and connecting to myself and my culture. There's this real importance of just like storytelling. And I live for it, because it's like you don't get to hear it, or you don't get to see, or I can't go and like look up, you know, anything from my ancestors. I've tried to look up my last name. We've done like 23andMe. Like there's just like very limited information that exists by way of like data and writing and whatnot. But so much of it is carried on through our voices and through telling this story, that it is something that is just so important to me, to like continue to tell the stories and to continue to sort of pass on for the generations that you know will come after me. And so I shared a little bit about, you know, how we got here in the early 50s. My grandpa was the first person to come to the US and work with other migrant workers. And I learned only recently, actually, in February, that he was the person that sponsored my great grandparents, so my grandmother's parents. And my grandmother comes from a family of, I think they're 13 kids. And my grandpa was the person that sponsored a majority, I think about half, if not more than half, of her siblings to become US citizens here.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And so it's like wild that I didn't know that, but it just made it that much more important, like the legacies that we leave behind, and you know, the things that then people have gone off to do. We have like doctors in our families, we have aspiring lawyers. My cousin just started law school. We have engineers. My brother worked with the US military in Japan, like so many different, you know, people contributing. And I was very excited to write that, and also very, very nervous to write that post.
I can imagine. I can
You just
imagine.
don't know how it'd be received.
Yeah, no, I love that you brought in storytelling and sort of how that is brought down, you know, through many different communities. I did something similar with my own grandparents who came here from Finland, and you know, before they passed away and before iPhones and being able to record things digitally, I had the little mini tape. Little tiny tape cassette thing that you could record people, and I would ask them questions and, you know, have them recorded. And if I didn't do that, there wouldn't be any record, you know, of their history and how they got together and how they came here and all of that stuff. And so it's I love that you shared that, and I think it's so important. And it's one of the fundamental things about every human being is connecting with themselves, is understanding where they came from, their origins and their people. And that just brings you closer to yourself and to your family and to your heritage.
Yeah.
So Jeanette, I appreciate all the time that you've spent with us here today, and answering all these questions. I know it's a kind of a vulnerable space to be in when we're talking about connected experiences. Are there any last words you'd like to share with the audience today? You know, any parting words or recommendations on how to connect with at work, or you know, with yourself or your heritage?
Oh my gosh, there's so much. I feel like I have a somewhat of an ask, I think, of people as they approach. I mean, I'm in the recruiting space, and so a lot of what I see or what I hear can be disheartening, right?
Yeah.
In terms of just how people talk about another person and not aware of the harm and the side effects of all of that. And so I think when we think about connected experiences, connecting to ourselves, connecting to our work, the plethora of things that we've talked about, is just to really listen to other people and listen to one of my old coworkers used to say this all the time: listen because you're seeking to understand, not because you're trying to come up with the next thing that you're going to say.
Yeah.
And I ask that because I find that, like, in the interview process especially, we're so like zeroed in on like, oh, this person has to have X, Y, and Z. They have to have
Right.
worked it, this, that, and the other. But like,
Mhm.
if you listen to the ways in which people talk about their experiences and the ways that they talk about their work, I guarantee that you're going to be able to pick up on something that you didn't even know, and a
Yeah.
skill set that your team may actually really need. And so, yeah, I just want to say, like, listen to people.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
my
That's a
like
great ask.
takeaway.
Great
Yeah.
ask and some great last words. So again, appreciate the time that you've spent here with us today, and look forward to having you on again.
Thank you.